Welcome to another installment of Strange Planet. What happens when one of the most powerful news agencies in the world decides its real job isn't to inform the public, but to protect a dictator? That's exactly what happened when Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin were caught on a hot mic joking about organ transplants and living to 150 years on the very ground where the CCP once mowed down thousands of its own people in Tiananmen Square. Reuters had the footage. They distributed it. And then, when Beijing ordered them to take it down, they obeyed. No legal obligation, no genuine licensing issue, just blind obedience to the party line. My guest today, Jekielek, has been exposing this kind of cowardice and complicity for more than 2 decades. He's senior editor at the Epoch Times and host of American Thought Leaders. He's interviewed everyone from heads of state to dissidents and whistleblowers, and he's produced acclaimed documentaries on censorship, lockdowns, and forgotten victims. His forthcoming book, Killed to Order, takes us inside one of the most horrifying industries in the world, China's practice of forced organ harvesting from prisoners of conscience. Jan's path to this fight was unlikely. Once a biologist studying lemurs in Madagascar, he found himself helping Chinese dissidents escape across the Golden Triangle. That's where he learned the value of truth and the cost of ignoring it. And today he joins me to discuss what happens when Western media willingly acts as a propaganda arm of Beijing, and why the grotesque practice of killing people for their organs isn't just China's dirty secret. It's the ultimate symbol of how the CCP devalues human life and how easily the West is learning to do the same. Jan, welcome to Strange Planet. How are you?
Richard, it's so good to be here with you.
Let's start with the hot mic moment itself, and I'll insert the video later when we package this podcast. But Xi and Putin joking about living to 150 through organ transplants, possibly harvested organs, on the blood-soaked ground of Tiananmen Square, no less. I mean, what does this moment reveal about how these men see themselves and the rest of humanity?
This is by the way, a fantastic question, because that's exactly the question we want to be asking. I'm not entirely sure they were joking, okay, first of all. And I can tell you that the whole moment was rather surreal, because not 2 weeks before this happened, right, before Xi and Putin are talking about potentially achieving immortality through continual organ transplantation, this is where I got the contract to write this book. Right, and the premise of the book actually is that if you had one issue that you could explain a lot of how the Chinese Communist Party operates and what it does and how it thinks, it would be this issue, right? And it's almost like I feel like this hot mic moment actually does that, right? Because we have this situation where, they're musing about long life, and we already know that senior Chinese leaders live an unusually long life. And it's, not entirely clear why that is. We know there's this organ industry which has been in play, where there's basically, and we're talking about here, just to kind of flesh out what you said, we're talking about prisoners of conscience, religious believers, incarcerated en masse, being used as unwilling organ donors for an estimated $9 billion industry annually. But more importantly, in a sense, and this is, again, what this hot mic moment reveals, unlimited available organs for the Chinese super elites. And I think in a sense, that makes, that $9 billion number that is kind of small when you think about what the implications are of, unlimited organs if you are part of this super elite class.
Right, and we are talking about, when we talk about prisoners of conscience, we're talking about adherents to Falun Gong, this spiritual philosophy that, well, I don't know what the exact numbers are, but it's pretty widespread in China, or at least it was. I'm guessing also probably the Muslim minority in China, the Uyghurs, possibly underground Christians as well in China, again, being arrested and instead of being executed right away, they are kept alive and then their organs harvested. I mean, are they given, well, get into some detail here. How are these organs taken from these prisoners? Are they even anesthetized? I mean, I dare to think how horrific this really is.
Yeah, it's horrific, but let me give you a little bit more context here, right? China is the only place in the world. There are organ industries in different countries. There are black markets for organs. This is something that happens. It's serious. There's attempts to kind of stop it. You hear these stories of people waking up in a bathtub, with a kidney taken out on ice, this kind of thing. In China, it's the only place where it happens at the scale that it does, which is we're talking something, the best estimates are about 60 to 90,000 transplants a year without any real credible, with maybe a very small amount of organs that might be credibly harvested, i.e. from someone who had consented, who was brain dead and body alive. And there's a lot of indicators of this. I'll give you just one quick example. Something I've often referenced prior to this survivor of this practice actually coming to light, which is someone I never thought we'd ever see. I'd like to tell you about that. But there's a paper that was published in the American Journal of Transplantation a few years back titled Execution by Organ Procurement. Okay, and this will speak directly to your question here. Now, what they did was the researchers went in and looked at a whole suite of Chinese transplant literature, published peer-reviewed literature, and they looked through the research methods and they asked the question, are there examples in this literature where the dead donor rule is violated? What does that mean? There's a very strict, rigorous ethical process that should happen whenever you're considering in a civilized country, whenever you're considering harvesting organs from someone, because you can't harvest organs from a completely dead body. Okay, so the way that we deal with this question is that you have to be brain dead, total flat line, right? But body alive. Mm-hmm. Okay, and so a doctor needs to establish this, and there's actually typically an ethics-oriented team that establishes this, ensures that this is the case. I've actually even interviewed a doctor recently that's talked about examples where American doctors have misdiagnosed initially. He goes in to check, he throws a scope in, and the person starts coughing, and they're like, nope, we're not harvesting this one. Okay, so there's this whole process that happens. In the Chinese transplant literature, and this was not a comprehensive test, they found at least 70 instances where there's clear violation of the dead donor rule. So now to answer your question directly, that means that the method of execution, the method that this person was killed, was the organ extraction itself. Okay? I understand that it's very common for there not to be anesthetic involved because these people are, from the perspective of the Chinese Communist Party, disposable. They've been targeted for eradication by the regime. These are the words of the original dictator that started this attack on Falun Gong. His name was Jiang Zemin. He was going to destroy them physically, bankrupt them financially, and destroy their reputations. They like to do things in threes. So this was kind of the guidance. And so what happened was prior to that, this happened in the year 1999, where the Chinese Communist Party turned on the Falun Gong. There were 70 to 100 million. You alluded there's a lot of people. The government census showed there were 70 to 100 million people doing this practice. We also know that Jiang was very jealous of the founder of Falun Gong. His name is Li Hongzhi. This person had the love of millions of people, appreciation. It was a bit truthfulness, compassion, forbearance were the principles that these people lived. They were known to be, good members of society. And as a dictator, he could never have that love and appreciation. So there was jealousy. It was bigger than the Communist Party. And really the other part about it was that it doesn't fit neatly into the obsessive Chinese Communist Party hierarchy. Every communist society is obscenely hierarchical in ways that are even difficult to imagine for those of us who like hierarchies. So anyway, Falun Gong didn't work very well. They made it illegal. And the term, the action was to get rid of it. But that didn't mean necessarily kill everybody. It just meant re-educate them, transform them, break their wills. But these people, they turned out to be very resilient. Okay, and that's when this persecution, where it really went into high gear. there was this rule made in the camps and prisons and re-education through labor camps and so forth that Falun Gong deaths would be considered suicides. Why? Because it just meant you can use whatever means to transform, to re-educate this person, to transform them. I hate that term, but that's what they use. And so people started dying, from torture and so forth. And so now you have this unbelievably vulnerable population. They're arresting all sorts of people for being Falun Gong. It's illegal. They're putting millions of people into the system. The special rapporteur on torture, I think it was around 2005, was estimating that half of all the people in the entire system were Falun Gong, right? And at the same time, what you're seeing is this massive, almost exponential growth of the Chinese organ industry, okay? And remember, these are people who are not giving their names because they don't want to implicate their fellows, right? They're just in the system. They're being tortured to death. They disappear. No one's imagining at this time that they could be being actually harvested here, okay? And so this kind of a terrible crime against humanity evolves, and Chinese hospitals are now starting to advertise, 2 weeks I can get you a heart, 2 weeks I can get you a liver, kidney, whatever.
Right. That's the big tip off. That's the big tip off, right? Because typically you go on a waiting list, but they're providing these, or they're supplying these organs like made to order. Oh, you need a heart? I have a heart. You need a kidney? I've got a kidney. That should be the tip-off to, I guess, what do we call this? The black market organ donor tourism industry. And I would imagine that the Falun Gong adherents would be targeted not only for their beliefs, but also because of their spiritual practice. These are very healthy people, right? You want viable organs, you need healthy people.
Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of a perfect storm of sorts. And there's also this dimension of, it's difficult for people that grow up in free societies to understand how obsessively hierarchical and supremacist the Communist Party is in these totalitarian communist societies. They really need to control everything. There's no semblance of civil society. There's nothing independent. Okay, nothing can be truly independent of the regime. As long as you're implementing the strategies or the approaches or the needs of the top, you can function very well. And in fact, as someone I interviewed recently, a scholar from Stanford named Chenggang Xu has been studying the CCP for decades, has pointed out, in China, they've kind of created a market around implementing the CCP, central CCP's policy. Okay, or not policy, but yeah, basically strategic direction, if you will. So I imagine happened, right, was you had this situation in one of the provinces where someone said, hey, wait a sec, okay, we're charged with growing our transplant industry, I know that, and we're charged with getting rid of Falun Gong, right? And so by whatever means, is sort of because they've been dehumanized, there's this massive hate propaganda campaign to basically dehumanize these people straight out of 1930s Germany. I'm talking about like that language. They probably just literally took it because some of it is the same. And wait a sec, they're like, hey, wait a sec, this is a win-win here. I can use these people. We can blood type and tissue type them ahead of time. We can know, the basic parameters. And now, we can make money from this. And also we can supply our super elites. It's a win-win-win for everyone. And the moment this very evil person figured this out, of course, it's win-win-win only in the most, horrific sense you can possibly imagine. Everybody else saw that this was happening. This person was achieving all of these different goals, right? All at once, they had to get in on it because now the central committee is looking down and saying, hey, why aren't you doing, look at how well these guys are doing, right? And it's like this perverse competition across all sorts of directives that the regime has to implement them, which kind of both keeps people in line and doing, things they really wouldn't want to do. And that's actually what Chenggang argues is how the Chinese Communist Party survived beyond the Soviet Communist Party, which was much more, directives from the top, not strategic direction from the top. And then, that was the innovation the Chinese made. So here we are, right? We're in this situation, and this human rights crisis happens. And because you mentioned correctly that we believe now that the Uyghur population, or Uyghur as they I think more typically call themselves, they're also being targeted in this way now. So again, what happened is some years back, the regime decided that this is going to be the next group it goes after seriously, put millions into concentration camps, and that created the same vulnerable situation, right? So now, as the world just sort of ignored all these years, with the exception of the last few years, and I'll explain why that is a little bit, it has to do with the survivor coming to light. Someone, again, I never thought I'd ever imagine that we would ever find one. And all these years, I've been looking at this for 20 years. This horrible approach to getting organs shifted in some measure to the Uyghurs. And from what I've also learned, there is an actual market, and this will sound terrible, and it is, for so-called halal organs. Muslims tend to prefer to have Muslim organs. So it becomes kind of a specialty group. I mean, this is a crime yet to be seen on this planet, as described by David Matus, one of the original researchers, Nybirth Council, actually, out of Winnipeg, a fellow Canadian. So, yeah, terrible things happening.
I see very little light between the Nazi Germany and the CCP. No light between them. The real scandal here isn't what was caught on a hot mic. It's that Reuters had the footage, they distributed it, and then they yanked it because Beijing told them to. How did one of the most powerful Western news agencies become, in effect, a vassal of the CCP?
Well, okay, let me tell you what I think about this whole situation, because I agree it's terrible what you're saying. I agree. But I think I need to kind of explain a little bit about how it works with communist China in the first place, okay? And this has actually been one of the huge problems, one of the huge propaganda or information warfare coups that the Chinese Communist Party has been able to achieve, and indeed every Communist Party tries to achieve, is incredible control of the information flow, okay? And the CCP, there's been multiple pieces written on this, including research papers, controls information in numerous ways. It does it with respect to people who are China scholars by, for example, by letting everybody know very clearly what areas are okay areas to cover that might seem a little bit critical of the regime, and what areas, if you cover, will have your visa pulled immediately. Okay, and this is a very powerful tool, because if you're a China scholar and you suddenly don't have access to China, your career takes a bad turn, let's say, okay? Now, so you're kind of always making the deal with the devil. It's the absolute same thing with the media, okay? In our case, we had journalists in there and they all got huge prison sentences very early on, and we had to take all our sources underground, right? And so because we were actually founded in Atlanta, Georgia, and a Toronto edition sprung up, and in multiple places around the world. But for most media that want to have access to communist China, they do it purely at the pleasure of the Chinese regime. And the Chinese regime has its rules about what people that are in China are allowed to cover. And if you cover things that it really doesn't like, and forced organ harvesting is at the top of that list, you're just not going to get that access, and that. So in a way, okay, and this is to be fair, I don't think people should be making this deal with the devil. I think there's other ways to do it, but people do, and it's a tough decision, and I kind of understand it at some level, because you want to get some kind of access. Okay, now let's go to Reuters. Let's go to specifically. We take footage from Reuters. We modify Reuters articles with some information that we get some information from Reuters. So Reuters isn't exactly the situation. Reuters has been playing this game with the CCP all these years, right, to get access. There's a number of issues, like, for example, democracy movement, okay? Falun Gong writ large, Tibetan independence, Uyghur independence, or what they call East Turkestan. All of these things are, and of course, Taiwan independence would be another one. These things are very sensitive areas, okay, taboo areas almost, and you write about them with great You have to be very careful, otherwise you're going to get knocked out. Or I think even house Christians and the sort of flourishing and growth of the Christian church in China would now fit into that as well, right? So here we go. Reuters is in this situation, and they're initially putting this up because it was on state TV, right? So that is a major message that this is okay, right? And wow, this is like huge news, right? So they're publishing it, but then the CCP decides to revoke, their permission basically, and that's now you have to make your choice, right? And you'd be good, but you're already playing along all the way. So do I think it's let's just say there's I think there's much worse things that legacy media do than necessarily pulling this feed in this case, because they're already kind of playing along with this deal. And, they only published it because they thought it was okay because Chinese state television published it.
Right.
Does that make sense? So I'm just trying to frame the picture, and you can kind of decide what the moral valence of that is, right? But I think a lot of people just don't understand how controlled all coverage on communist China is for anyone that has an office there.
Well, yeah. So they made the Faustian bargain that if we want to continue to report on anything in China, we're going to have to, I guess, play ball, as
That's right.
distasteful as that decision was. But the influence and the censorship, this influence the CCP has, I mean, it extends overseas. I spoke with a member of the Chinese cultural theater dance group Shenyun, Li Shai Lemish, who told me that there are mainstream media outlets in North America who are being influenced by the CCP, and in their campaign, for example, to demonize Falun Gong here in North America and elsewhere in Europe. Talk to me about that.
Oh, I mean, 100%. I mean, notably, right, if you were talking with Li Shai, I know Li Shai, I've known him for quite a number of years. And he's one of the hosts of Shenyun, one of the 8 groups that travels all over the world, presenting the show. A fantastic show, by the way. I would recommend. Have you seen it?
I haven't, but I'm interested, because this is a portrait of China before the communists took over. This is real Chinese culture.
Well, so let me just mention a little bit about that, because it seems kind of odd maybe for the CCP to be so obsessed with a show. I mean, they're so obsessed that in the U.S., okay, there's 2 Chinese agents that are in jail because they tried to bribe someone they thought was an IRS agent to revoke Shenyun's nonprofit status in the U.S. It's New York-based company, and this was actually an FBI sting operation, right? But like that is a level of interference, okay, what you would call transnational repression, that is kind of unbelievable. Like, really? Well, why would you feel so threatened by a dance group to try to do this? Or you have this guy that parachutes into the area where they have a school and Shenyun training area and all of this in up near Middletown, New York. This guy parachutes into the area. I've lived there for a number of years in China, and suddenly starts launching environmental lawsuit after environmental lawsuit against this Shenyun school and college and everything. And it's the last one now was dismissed with prejudice, so it can't launch anymore. But this is wildly distracting. It's bad media, bad faith with other local people. I mean, it's just a mess and wild distraction. And these are just two examples. Why would they be so obsessed with this? Well, it's because it showcases what traditional Chinese culture was like, and like really what one of the biggest fallacies that the Chinese Communist Party has been able to kind of impose on the world, I would say, even, is that they say, because they're supremacist, their survival of the party is above everything else, right? They say, we are China, we are the Chinese people, we are full fully representative of the Chinese people. We are not representative. We are the voice of the Chinese people. We are China. And of course, that's an insane assertion. In fact, I think nothing really could be further from the truth. But Shen Yun specifically targets this falsehood, right? Which is they say, no, China is the traditional culture. It's these amazing myths and legends. It's these folk dances. It's these, old imperial dances. It's these stories. It's this deep spirituality that permeates all of Chinese culture until the Communist Party takes over, right? China before communism. And also, by the way, the communists do some pretty horrible things, and that's shown in dance. So the combination of all that, I've only ever met one person. I've been going to see the show for a couple of decades, so basically since they started. We've been sponsors of the show at Epoch Times for a very long time. And I mean, it's amazing. It's a whole new show every year. I've only ever encountered one person. I've talked to tons of people about it. What do you think? How did it go? And this was a very cynical, unhappy human being, right? My point is that it really inspires people in the process. So you have people that are being exposed to how terrible communism is. Mostly they're being exposed to the beauty of traditional Chinese culture. They're coming out feeling fulfilled. And, it doesn't make the CCP look very good along the way. And it's a couple of million a year that get to see it, right? So this is why, right, it seems to me, and this is the part where I feel a little bit, I don't know, maybe culpable isn't the right word, okay? But, at Epoch Times, we've been reporting all sorts of things other than China for a long time, right? Most notably, I mean, I really started having a lot of trouble with these legacy media when we started reporting on something called Russiagate. Mm-hmm. You're familiar with this term,
yes.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, Russiagate was, for those that are uninitiated, it was this idea that the presidential candidate in 2016 and then the president himself was a Russian asset, like a Putin agent. Okay, that was and this was actually a dirty tricks campaign that was created by the Clinton campaign in sort of as part of the election battle. The problem was that for the first time, the U.S. Government agency actually got involved and in essence supported it, right? And so this is a huge scandal, a big problem. But when we started reporting on this, we didn't know what was going on. The one thing that we did know was that the thing that every legacy media was reporting was not true, which is that the idea that the presidential candidate and then president was a Russian asset was preposterous. There was never any evidence for it, like zero. I mean, like really. And so,
yeah. In fact, evidence to the contrary was ignored by someone in the Obama administration and then weaponized by the DOJ and.
Right. Well, but at the beginning, we just got into the crosshairs because we weren't reporting the correct way, mm-hmm. right? And so there's these people. I think there are people kind of, in all of our country, whether it's Canada and the U.S., there's people with very left-leaning, view of how the world is supposed to work. They're trying to engineer the world to look that way. And here, and for whatever reason, all these legacy media are kind of, pushing this idea. I think part of it was just massive groupthink, to be perfectly honest, and part of it was bad actors, and it's a kind of a whole mix, right? But we were not doing that, and suddenly we're the odd ones out, and suddenly we're being targeted, right, with hit pieces and all sorts of stuff. They're taking away our ability to advertise on Facebook, all sorts of stuff. And the thing is, the one thing about us, we're a little slow sometimes. But like in terms of getting the information out, but we get it out right. This is where we've excelled, right? We don't have to do retractions very often. So we don't publish until we're pretty darn sure that what we're publishing is correct. And so they didn't have anything to actually attack us with. What did they do? Many of them, and I find this particularly reprehensible, they attacked the faith of our founders. We were founded by Falun Gong practitioners back in the day to expose communist China, back in 1999 when all this started, right? Or in 2000, technically. And so, but now they're basically using the talking points that the CCP is using to justify eradicating these people, right? And they're using that basically to attack us. They're saying, oh, look, Falun Gong is these bad things and so forth. That's horrible, right? This is like, these are crimes against humanity are being perpetuated by by this regime against these people, and you're going to use that language, right, to try to attack us, to score points against us. It's horrible, right?
Sorry, I would just say there's this long-standing love affair with the communist regime in China, here in Canada as well. I mean, going back to all the way back to Dr. Norman Bethune and Pierre Trudeau, who practically worshipped at the feet of Mao, and his son, who had what did you call it, an admiration for the Chinese dictatorship, for the way that they were able to, turn policies on a dime and so forth. And the media obviously follows suit. We have Chinese police stations, communist Chinese police stations operating on Canadian soil, harassing Chinese Canadians. To me, there's very little difference between communist China and Nazi Germany. It's just incomprehensible that we would be sucking up to them this way.
Well, right. And this is what I was saying. Like, I feel like some culpability. If we didn't report the way we reported on all these issues, that this wasn't the only issue. There's many things which most of these legacy media got so horribly wrong that it's honestly embarrassing. Like the origins of the virus is another example. I happen to have a background in biology, as you pointed out earlier. Thank you for doing that. So, it was maybe extra easy for me to notice that the narrative that was being pushed out was preposterous. I mean, it was just obviously false and wrong. Like, you didn't need a third-year degree. You didn't even need a third-year biology education to figure that out. But it was pushed so hard, right? So anyway, we're kind of in this situation where I feel like the CCP found some fellow travelers in America that didn't like us, in particular, and are using that. And the CCP's, meanwhile, whole project has been to get rid of Falun Gong all these years. Because, by the way, why is that? Well, because Falun Gong didn't go away. Falun Gong didn't get crushed. It just simply, built 200,000 what they call material sites, and is going around as we're recording right now, millions of people are going around to their fellow Chinese saying, hey, you know what? I'm a Falun Gong practitioner. I'm a good, decent human being. This is the truth about us. And actually, this is the truth about the Communist Party. And they're involved in all this horrible stuff. They have this horrible history. And by the way, maybe you should quit the party, because this isn't good for you to be a part of. And millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people have actually done this over the last 20 years, amazingly, right? So Falun Gong has kind of flourished and ended up being, I don't know if numerically flourished, right? Because there were 70 to 100 million, right, when the persecution started. It's hard to know for us what exactly the numbers are today. I've heard different estimates, but it's almost unknowable, right? But they basically constitute one of the largest, probably the largest civil disobedience movement, peaceful in the world, active, right? And unrepentant. So the CCP basically created this, and now they want to, use whatever tools they have to stamp out any messaging that might be positive towards Falun Gong or exposes the Chinese Communist Party. And they I don't even know entirely if some of these people that are effectively pushing these narratives, like, for example, one very prominent one against Shen Yun and against Falun Gong is in the New York Times, where they published something like 12 hit pieces. I'm sure Li Shai talked about this because it's just really kind of outrageous.
Yeah, well, the New York Times comes by that honestly. We know how they reported on Stalin back in the 1930s, and nothing to see there, folks. The information, is this getting out now to? I'm sure there are many people who are in a desperate situation. They need an organ for whatever reason. They can't get one elsewhere, so it must be a horrible situation to be in, obviously. But is this information now getting out to people? Do they now understand that if they're traveling to China, they're likely getting an organ from a prisoner of conscience?
Thank you for asking this. In the last couple of years, there's been a kind of a major breakthrough in awareness. And I still think it's very far from a level that we would want. I would like everyone to understand this reality. That's certainly not the case. However, having watched this for 20 years, the last couple of years have been utterly incredible. I mean, in the sense that the Cheng Pei-ning, who is the survivor of this forced organ harvesting, I mean, this guy, I've interviewed a number of Holocaust survivors. One of my father-in-law was a Holocaust survivor. One of the films you mentioned is a kind of what we call an optimistic Holocaust documentary. So I'm just familiar with Holocaust survivors' stories, and this guy's story kind of reads a bit like that. And that just means that there was certain death down this path, but he happened to take this path, and then somehow he was deathly ill, but somehow he woke up from that, right? And just step after step after step, and finally he gets to the finish line. And he ends up being able to escape to Thailand and eventually get rescued by an assistant secretary of state here in the US to America, right? And to tell his tale, to tell the story of what had happened to him. And when you scan his body, you notice that they took a significant part of his liver and part of his lung out, and there's a giant gash on his side. And it's sort of, the smoking gun that you could never find, because the murder site is an operating room. And it's always scrubbed clean. And it's like, hey, nothing happened, So anyway, that was huge. More in Europe, to be honest, there was, massive coverage, a little less in America, but a significant number of people noticed it. And there's multiple pieces of legislation in the US now. There's 6 states that have passed legislation that prevents insurance and Medicare from covering basically China transplants. That's good legislation. There's one federal piece of legislation in committee in the U.S. House right now. And there's 2 that have actually passed the House. One is called the Falun Gong Protection Act. Another one is called the Stop Forced Organ Harvesting Act. One is focused on China entirely, sanctioning people there. Another one is focused more broadly on sanctioning people involved in the trade, but with a little bit of a focus on China, because it's a whole different level of atrocity in communist China. So yes, at the government level, there's more awareness, and at the people's level, there's more awareness. And I hope that this book can help contribute to further awareness and maybe getting some of this, I would say completely apolitical and just, basic human dignity oriented legislation passed.
Kill to Order, your upcoming book. How can we get a copy?
So I'm in process here. Okay, it's up. You can pre-order it on Amazon, and I think those sort of the bigger places where you can order books right now. But Amazon is the obvious one. The publisher Skyhorse, it's on their site as well, and it's coming out in February. But I encourage you to pre-order anyway.
And if people want to subscribe to the Epoch Times, how do they do that?
So just go to theepochtimes.com, and on the top right, you'll see a little button that says subscribe. And, we are mostly supported by our individual subscribers. This is one of the ways we actually can stay independent and not kind of driven by any corporate interests or even overly large donors. That's part of our strategy.
And just before we say goodbye, can you give us maybe a bit of a sense of what is happening in China? I know that's a huge question, but people talk about China as, the country of the future, and that's certainly the way it's been reported in the Western media. China is going to take over. They're going to usurp the United States as the number 1 economy and so forth. And yet, we know that they have serious demographic problems. They are in what's called a demographic winter, partially because of their one-child policy. And all the attendant problems that come with that. So you've got an enormous cohort of young single men with no prospects of ever marrying. And that means they have huge societal issues like crime and so forth. That's what happens when men don't get married. Then they have the real estate crash, which made, 2008, 2009 look like a stroll in the park. What are your thoughts about the immediate future of China, let's say over the next 5 years?
Well, so there's kind of 2 routes. And this is interesting because I really think this is kind of an inflection point right now. I've often described this recent assassination of Charlie Kirk in America as an inflection point. You can see it's a cultural moment. He had a powerful message that he shared: don't hate your enemy, communicate across the aisle, connect, convince, and do it courageously and stand behind your faith. It's kind of an interesting inflection point. I think communist China is in its own interesting inflection point because it's a parasitic economy. It was built mainly by the United States, but basically by the West. They were very effective. To the credit of the people who orchestrated this, they very effectively, siphoned off unbelievable amounts of capital. And some of it stole a lot of it. I mean, there's different pieces to it, but kind of worked hand in hand with Americans and others to accomplish this. It wasn't just purely China, but it's not an economy that has a future as it exists right now. Okay, and it's very brittle, and it's a kind of a one pillar, which is their exports, basically, which that's not a good way. And there really is no strong internal market. People are saving like crazy. Half the people are what the vice president of the U.S. called peasants, basically like migrant workers, right? I don't know if people would mind that word in general, but some people here don't like it. Anyway, it's a highly problematic situation. And of course, there's what we call the Gini coefficient is very huge. So in other words, the super elite really hold the vast majority of the wealth. That's a bit, relatively small number of people. So, okay, in this context, at the same time, okay, there's been all this, great development and so forth that's happened, right? Again, with the support of the largely the U.S. economy and so forth. And so here we are, okay? At the same time, there's this quit the Chinese Communist Party movement that's been happening, okay? So there's about 450 plus now million people that have done that. In a totalitarian society, this is one of the things, like the promise, one of the lures that the regime gave to the U.S. and other Western countries, right? I just say the U.S. because the U.S. is sort of their primary target, and that's where the biggest markets are and everything, right? The lure was they basically said we're just authoritarian. We're kind of like, say, a Taiwan, right, where there's nationalists and there's this incipient civil society that's starting people with different ideas. And what Taiwan did was they transitioned from an authoritarian dictatorship to one of the most robust democracies today. And these are the Chinese, by the way, right? So the kind of that you could see that this is possible, right? And so, the thing that the Chinese Communist Party did was they kind of fooled us into believing that they were authoritarian and could change and could evolve and become like us. This was the dream, right? And by the way, we would make tons of money doing it. It's a lot harder to notice that you're being fooled when your pocket is being filled with big bills, big bills and stuff like that. So they fooled us into thinking that they're just authoritarians, not totalitarians, which means that absolutely everything functions at the pleasure of the party always, right? And any real independence is crushed or removed. Why? Because it's viewed as one of the biggest threats to the Communist Party in the first place. The internal threat is bigger than the external. That's something a lot of people, that's distinctive of communist societies. So we have this movement, which is apolitical in a sense, in that there isn't a desire to topple the regime specifically or to replace it with a specific alternative or something like that. But you have 450 million people that have decided, hey, we're done with this. They're not ready to go out in the street and say it publicly because they get cut down.
Right.
But they are ready to put it past. Again, that we have a book called "The Specter of Communism is Ruling Our World," right? Communism, in a sense, is like a specter. It demands your obedience. It demands your allegiance. Okay, and so it's very significant. People are saying, you know what? I don't really want to be a part of that, and I'm going to do it privately. But so you have this nucleus of quite a few people that have been thoughtful enough to put communism behind them. And here's the thing, right? The CCP isn't China, as we discussed earlier. Incredibly hardworking people, right? I think actually quite innovative, if not under a totalitarian boot. I mean, I think a free China would actually give the U.S. a serious run for its money, and Canada, and make people think, hey, wait a sec, we gotta get our butts in gear here because these guys are, we're supposed to be the capitalists. These guys have suddenly become more the capitalists than we are, right? Under the boot of the totalitarian regime, where graft, you talk about crime, right? Graft is the centerpiece of that, right? Everyone's kind of taking a cut. Everyone is cynical. It's very difficult for that to happen. And that brittleness, the moment that cash flow stops from the US, I think that kind of takes them over the edge. But there is a bright way for this to end, which is the Chinese people to self-actualize, right? And I really think that's a very real possibility, and figure out what kind of a system they want to live in. Because to me, it seems like the Chinese Communist Party's rule is kind of getting to that point where, decisions will, some sort of change is going to happen. That's what it looks like to me. But I can't tell you how it's going to go, right? Because this is obviously this is a volatile thing, right? They've done everything they absolutely can. This has been their obsession to avoid what happened in the Soviet Union from happening. They've studied that, intently, and they absolutely have been trying to avoid that. But totalitarian be totalitarian. It's very hard to think outside of that weird mentality that treats people as just tools to be used for the betterment of the system of the party.
Yeah, ultimately it is doomed to failure because it just does not understand the human condition. So they can prolong it, I guess, but, God willing, the truth will prevail. Jan, a great pleasure sitting down with you. Thank you so much for this.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. This is a great conversation.
Jan Jekielek is the senior editor at the Epoch Times.
A new Richard Syrett's Strange Planet drops every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.